Everyone, and welcome back to the Dialogue of Continents that we are hosting with my colleagues here and in Wopol with the Hamburg Institute for International Economics. Welcome to all our speakers coming from all over the world. I'm pleased to now introduce our chair, Shamshad Akhtar, the former head of UN ESCAP, who is going to chair these interesting sessions. The one before talk a lot about a new modified globalization, what will happen to emerging markets in terms of capital flow and in terms of their growth model. So this session will liaise very well with financing post-COVID-19 recovery in emerging market. We have a very well-balanced group of speakers coming from the private market, former policymakers, and international institutions. I would like to thank also EBRD, Mattia for their ongoing support with this forum particularly, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion. Shamshad, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be joining your session, and Mark, you have indeed collected a group of distinguished panelists, so it's my honor to be chairing this session. The way I'm going to proceed is open up the discussion with few remarks and then introduce the panelists, and then we will move forward. So as everybody knows, this session is about SDG financing, post-COVID-19 recovery in emerging markets. And it is the Reinventing Bretton Woods session. COVID has dealt a severe blow to emerging markets and developing countries. World is faced today with triple crises, pandemic, debt and climate crisis, and few other things going on. Pre-pandemic, there were already signs of growing stress in the system, global system, and of course, the buildup of debt stands out. While the governments across the globe have not really progressed very well on the sustainable development goals, and most of them are falling short of targets with the exception of few. And the action on climate agenda, regrettably, is also below the NDCs, the nationally defined contributions. There are, of course, several factors contributing to delayed action on sustainability and inclusiveness, which are the two core areas of the UN development agenda. Among others, the topic that we are dealing with is the financing for sustainable development across developing and emerging markets remains well below massive requirements. And there have been a variety of estimates out there. One of our panelists will go into the numbers also, hopefully. At the same time, the growing and unsustainable debt levels have casted shadow over the prospects and ability of the sovereigns to tap markets for SDG financing. Pre-COVID-19, countries have galvanized unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus to revive global economy, and IFIs have played a remarkable role in terms of offering the need for rapid financing instruments and other facilities to offer liquidity and assistance for a sustainable recovery, but are also looking at the ways on how sustainable financing can be mainstream. And we hope to hear from our colleagues from IMF and EBRD on this front much more. The second point which will come under discussion is the financing a sustainable future for emerging markets requires emerging markets to deploy almost 4% of GDP, and for the low-income countries, almost 15% of GDP to reach SDGs by 2030. A third topic, which will, of course, be brought in by other colleagues, will be the whole discussion that has been triggered by IMF's scenario analysis, which suggests, and I quote, a comprehensive policy strategy to mitigate climate change could boost global GDP in the first 15 years of the recovery by about 0.7% of global GDP on average, and employment for about half of that period, leading to about 12 million extra persons being employed globally. Now that lends us a lot of hope, but is contingent on action and action. So this will also be creeping in our discussion. And the last point is the developing a global and more comprehensive debt relief program, which has been a subject of much debate. It's critical for emerging markets and low-income countries that face tremendous domestic shortfalls and slowdown in capital flows of different kinds. So I am on another platform articulating that debt relief should go beyond HIPC and low-income countries to developing countries where it's needed, and it should be extended beyond bilateral creditors to private creditors coming forward. Fiscal space should be deployed to stimulate uninterrupted green and inclusive recovery, and that is what would revive the economy in a qualitatively better manner. So with this, what are we going to be talking about in this backdrop? A very focused discussion around innovative sustainable investment strategies and product and market diversification in financing, because it's important that we catalyze private capital to promote sustainability and inclusiveness. Now, this should have happened with so much of fiscal space that has been created by the IFI's funding, but it hasn't happened. And I can tell you where I am sitting, Pakistan, that most of it has gone to really revive the economy and provide social safety net to the affectees. So what is critical, or for the repayment of the debt. So what is critical is to channelize sustainable financing and let it go to dedicated sustainable development goals to spur a more sustainable recovery. So with these observations and spanning out the context of the debate, let me recognize our distinguished panelists and introduce them a bit better. Romani Mattia, the Managing Director for Economics Policy Governance of EBRD, who's also a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Mr. Mattia served as Lord Nicholas Stern's Deputy on the Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Group on Climate Finance in 2010, and lots of other accomplishments. Mr. Roaf James is an Assistant Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, and I think we are delighted to have him concurrently as the IMF Climate Change Policy Coordinator. Prior to this, he served as a chief for Russia, Siberia, and several other key assignments of the IMF. Third distinguished speaker is Hugman Mike. He is Director Climate Finance at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, which is one of the largest philanthropic funders of climate action. He's working on SDG bonds linked to achieving specific SDG targets, which is the whole purpose of this discussion. He has also been involved in several platforms in his previous career. He served as a portfolio manager on emerging market blended debt and multi-asset for 91 Investec. We have with us Leslie, the Vice President of Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank, responsible for the Treasury portfolio management, finance, and accounting functions of the bank. Among others, he served as Managing Director and President of Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. Then we have Louis, last but not the least. He is the Global Head of Emerging Markets Research Group of JP Morgan in New York and was also affiliated in London. His work is remarkable. His research is extremely good. I've always enjoyed JP Morgan's research. So with this introduction, let me just lay down the rules of the game, that in the first round, each panelist will speak for 5 minutes, total of 9 minutes assigned, unfortunately because of time constraint. They will offer their perspective on global dynamics and SDG financing, post-COVID-19 recovery in emerging markets. And hopefully, after laying out their perspective, we would come back to the second round, which will allocate the remaining time with dedicated questions, should the time permit. So with this, let me turn now to our first panelist, Romani Mattia, Managing Director for the EBRD, to offer his perspective for the first 5 minutes. Over to you, Mattia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Shamshad, for the introduction and kind words. So I'll be brief, but I'll use a couple of pretty pictures if I can, just to make my case with some numbers. So I hope you'll be able to see this few slides that I want to use to make my case. So the case I want to make is that we really need to attract private investment to support emerging markets through this recovery, much more so than ever in the past. And this will be something that will be really urgent in the coming months. And then perhaps we could talk about the green component a little bit later, but I would like to start with this. Okay, so let me try first make the case that we've seen a substantial increase in government borrowing and in the stimulus to combat the crisis caused by this pandemic. But this increase has been, first of all, substantial across the world. It has been, or it is projected to be, even larger than the stimulus that we saw after the 2008 financial crisis. But having said this, if you look at emerging and developing countries, this stimulus is much smaller in terms of percentage of GDP than in the United States, China, or Europe. So in other words, public money is going into the economies to support them, but not at the same scale in emerging markets as it is in developed economies. Now, why is that the case? Well, because the space they have for borrowing is smaller. And this is what my second slide shows. It's a bit of a complex slide, so work with me for this few seconds to understand it. On the horizontal axis, you have the fiscal space index at the time of the first financial crisis, 2007, 2008. On the vertical axis, you have the fiscal space now in 2019. So the higher the fiscal space, the higher those dots will be. So if the fiscal space had been the same in 2007 and now, all those countries would be on the 45 degrees line, but they're not. What this chart shows very clearly is that particularly emerging and developing countries, which are identified with the red and yellow dots, the red ones are the EBRD countries of operations, sit on the bottom of this 45 degrees lines, which means the fiscal space now is smaller than it was after the financial crisis 2007, 2008. So the ability of the government to intervene in the economy in emerging markets is lower than it was before. And nevertheless, despite all of this, we see that the level of debt that will result from the borrowing to combat the COVID-19 crisis will go up substantially. So this chart tells you what the general government debt is as a percentage of GDP and how it's going to change this year due to the interventions that we saw. So despite the fact that the intervention in emerging markets, particularly in EBRD's countries of operations, this chart relates to our own countries of operations, despite the intervention is smaller than the intervention we see, say, in Europe, in the US or China, it will increase substantially the debt of our countries of operations. On average, debts will go up by 10, 12% in our countries, which is a substantial amount for countries that have already a fairly high level of government indebtedness. And then the last and final point I want to make in the introductory remarks is that this goes together with a secular trend, which we've observed since the last financial crisis, of decreased private sector flows into emerging markets. This chart depicts FDI inflow as a percentage of GDP, more or less from the first financial crisis to now. And we see that there's a negative trend. It shows both G7 and the EBRD region. And as you can see, while in 2007, there was a substantial difference between the two, with much more money flowing into emerging countries, EBRD countries of operations. Now this difference is not there anymore. So there's less FDI that we saw in the past going into our countries of operations. So the summary of this is that this financial crisis has not seen as big a response in emerging developing countries as in developed countries. Part of the reason is that the fiscal space of emerging and developing countries is smaller, substantially smaller than it was in 2007 and 2008. The level of indebtedness starts being at worrying levels, and it is going to increase substantially over the next year. And the private sector is not going to replace the government in terms of financial flows that could sustain growth in developed emerging countries. So that's the thesis that I pose of why we need substantial intervention from international financial institutions and MDBs to support emerging and developing countries post-crisis. The last point I wanted to make, I think I'll leave it to Michael because he does it much more eloquently than I can do, which is the fact that we've seen also this year less ability of emerging and developing countries to source their funding in the global financial markets. But as I said, I think Michael will make that case much more clearly than I can. So I'll stop here and happy then to cover why we think this intervention by MDBs and IFIs should be particularly in the green space. Shamshad, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you for a very graphic illustration of your case. Without losing any further time, let me turn to James Roaf from IMF, as I had pointed out. So over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share my screen as well. Can anybody?
Yes,
see
you're
that?
right. Yes, we can see it.
Here we go. Okay, so I will try to bring together the imperatives of spending and fiscal support for the recovery with the urgency of addressing the climate crisis at the same time. So this is a chart just showing what Shamshad already mentioned, is these estimates of spending needs to meet LDC, to meet SDGs. And this is, I should say, only in these 5 sectors: education, health, roads, electricity, and water. So this doesn't include the climate SDG directly in this estimate. So this was even before COVID. We had these very high spending needs for the SDGs. Now, of course, with COVID, you know, we see the SDGs receding, going backwards. There's estimates of 90 million people being pushed into extreme poverty in 2020 alone. And at the same time, governments, so the spending needs are going up, and governments are also more cash strapped because of the recessions they're facing. So we're really facing a serious financing problem. So there's one other point I wanted to make on the need for investment. This is from our recent fiscal monitor, which came out last month, which shows the case for public investment, and is generally making the case for governments that can afford it and have some fiscal space to continue in supporting the economy, and particularly to invest at this point, because we see analysis here showing very high multipliers for public investment in a situation like now, when you have extreme uncertainty. It's the uncertainty about the future that really makes these multipliers much higher. And the estimate here is that 1% of spending globally on public investment could raise out by 2.5% and provide 20 or 30 million jobs from that, because of this high effect. So there's every reason to be sort of bringing forward and to do investment policy at the moment. So then I want to come into why we think green investment is an important part of this, and this whole idea of greening the recovery. Now, it's true that the slowdown in activity this year has reduced emissions. But really, it's a very minor effect. If you look here at the chart, the green line showing emissions rising over the years, And then before COVID, we were projecting that to continue, that dashed green line going up at the top. Now, it's a bit hard to see, but with COVID, that green line has just shifted down in parallel a little bit. There's been a fall in 2020, maybe 5% cut in emissions. But then as recovery takes place, it's expected to rise again. So that compares with what's needed to get to Paris temperature goals. The 2-degree goal is that sort of downward facing orange line, and then to get to 1.5 degrees, which is really where we ought to be aiming, is an even more severe change. So what you can see from this is that, just slowing down growth for a year has had a tiny effect. You would need to keep doing that over and over until we're sort of living like cavemen, or we need to see a very significant change in the way that that the economy works in order to reduce our emissions per GDP, so we can continue to grow and at the same time meet climate goals. And I'll talk a little bit more about the package that you mentioned for this, the sort of policies we're recommending for this in a minute. On the spending side, again, there's also, we know climate change is coming. The question is how severe it is. These are new estimates also from our fiscal monitor about the sort of costs, and this is just for upgrading public assets, retrofitting, which is the biggest cost. It's much cheaper to build climate-resistant infrastructure anew than it is to retrofit existing infrastructure and buildings and so on, and coastal protection. You can see 1.5% a year, something like that, 1.5% a year in emerging markets and low-income countries for adaptation needs as well. So again, more spending pressures are needed. So we've set out, our view on the principles for how to go about this greening the recovery. So let me go through these very quickly. The first one is price carbon, right? And I really want to emphasize this because I think, as Mattia was saying, private investment is absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical. This is where most of the spending needs for both for adaptation and mitigation are going to have to come from, is from the private sector. And the most effective way to get that going for the biggest impact is to have a price on carbon that reflects the externality. It also is actually quite important from the point of view of the current situation lots of governments are in, that it brings in revenue. You may not want to bring it in very quickly in the recession, but over time it's going to be an important source of revenue for countries, including for paying for the public investment needed here. Countries are investing a lot at the moment in support measures. We estimate globally $12 trillion is being committed for fiscal support of various kinds. We think that countries should be looking at the climate impact of that, and I'll come on in a second to look at how that's happening. But in this way, they should be choosing to support green activities rather than polluting ones. And where it's a polluting activity, like a airline, for example, there should be green conditionality to improve that. As happened in the past for US automakers is a good example. Air France is an example now, more limited example, but we think that should be happening. Then making the financing green. This is very important to think about financing sources that countries can tap green financing. And the whole area of financial disclosure and transparency is going to be very important on the private sector financing side. Now, point 6 here: develop a new ambitious medium-term climate plan. This is where I think the new WEO chapter, with the World Economic Outlook that just came out last month, has a chapter on ways to address the climate problem while maintaining growth. And what they're proposing there is a large infrastructure push, public investment push at the beginning, which fits in with this idea of helping the recovery. That's one part of it. The second part of it is to have carbon prices clearly signaling rising going forward over time, to send a clear signal on investment. That's really where the biggest part of the emissions reduction is going to come from over time, is the carbon prices rising steadily over time. And the third element of that is the just transition element, because there are people who are going to, some households with high energy part of their spending. particularly regions, coal mining regions, and so on, that need to be supported. So you need to find within that overall package resources, which can come from the carbon pricing, resources to compensate and to address the needs of those sites, which is also extremely important from the political point of view to get this done. But it does add up to a package in their modelling, which supports growth at least over the short term because of the big investment push. But in the medium term and long term, maybe there's a very slight reduction in growth, but nothing compared, of course, to what would happen if we don't address the climate problem. And then finally, to coordinate with others, given that only the 4 biggest groups, the US, EU, China, and India make up more than half of total emissions, we think that in tandem with the Paris Agreement, it would be a good idea to have a carbon price floor, at least among that group, an agreement to address emissions through that. Finally, this is my last slide. We're just looking at this spending that's been done. We don't see that very much has been put into green activity so far. This is of these fiscal commitments, this 12 trillion that I'm talking about. We see actually that very few countries have made a significant green element of that. These are the shares, and as shares of GDP, they're very small. There are a few cases with green elements, but there's also a number of cases where there's been support for polluting industries without any conditionality. Now, we would hope that this will change going forward as support turns into longer term support. It's not so much immediate crisis support. The EU has made a lead with its promises on green investment going forward, but it's not a very impressive picture so far, I would say. So I will stop here and pass on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for that comprehensive overview on the greening stuff. Let me now turn to Mike, given that time is limited. And Mike's work is cut out. He knows he's done a lot of work. We're all excited, looking forward to hearing him out. Michael, over to you.
Very high hurdle for me to to meet there. So very complimentary to the fantastic points that Mattia and James have already made, and I think Luis, as the market practitioner and participant in the group, will be able to carry on with this. Having come from a career in investment, private investment, principally in emerging markets, I think to frame the point very bluntly, the current financing arrangements that we have in place, certainly for either countries, frankly for most emerging markets, certainly sub-investment grade, it isn't fit for purpose. The reality is that we've built a system over the last 20 to 25 years where we are seeking to finance fiscal policy in general, but particularly longer term investment in the SDGs and climate solutions, using what are effectively pro-cyclical risk assets, emerging market bonds and currencies relevant for global investors in local currency debt are pro-cyclical risk assets. This is not how we finance long-term investment and fiscal policy in counter-cyclical fiscal policy in the G20. So I think we need to frame all of the solutions that we're really looking to build around that very core problem. We need to develop instruments and markets that are more stable, more counter-cyclical, more liquid over time, but also actually, Shamshad, to your point, also where there is a higher absorptive capacity to ensure that money borrowed is spent on SDG aligned activities. So with that said, a few thoughts on what can get us there. I'm going to work in reverse order chronologically. So I think thinking about the long term and what we should be thinking about an end goal in 3-5 years time. James has mentioned a number of very important features, I think, that I won't elaborate on carbon taxes, the removal of fuel subsidies, frameworks for just economic transition. We're doing a lot of work, and partners of ours in South Asia, in Africa, on trying to build capacity for structuring those kind of arrangements. You know, it's complex because it has social elements, it has sovereign financing elements, it has energy system transition elements. We need capacity around that. I think in terms of financing instruments, we've written about and continuing to work on the idea of, I mean, we're calling SDG, IFI-backed SDG-linked bonds. There's a lot buried within that little phrase. I think on the SDG bond side, what we're thinking of is really an evolution of the current green and sustainability bond and loan markets. So actually based in part on the model that was used in countries like Nigeria and Uganda post the last round of debt relief, we had the virtual MDG funds that were designed, really combining a ring fence of proceeds and public expenditure management, more integrated and deeper multi-year budget processes, and the monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and outcome contingency that we see in some innovative sustainability-linked borrowing instruments that are emerging today. And I think we all collectively, the official sector, the ecosystem of think tanks and NGOs, and the private sector, Luis, we need to work towards those kind of instruments that are fit for delivering money borrowed into SDG outcomes in a much more concrete way. We believe that there is a need for more blended finance in that. That agenda has not been popular over the last few years. But I think the reality is that to reduce the pro-cyclicality and volatility of financing sources and to crowd in more private capital, that is going to have to come on the agenda. We're talking about potential fund structures like the Amundi IFC, a green bond fund that uses IFI capital in a junior equity tranche. We're talking about potential partial guarantees on individual instruments. There can be FX liquidity, there can be other, you know, specific risk insurance, be it political or catastrophe risk insurance. We do need to make sure, and Luis will probably talk more about this, that these things are developed in a way that is highly scalable. This needs to be the future of EM debt investing. So we are talking about large-scale funds, large-scale investors. Just to finish off, Shamshad, you know, the journey there is going to take a few steps. I would say that liquidity support in the short term, it's critical today to crowd private capital back in the next 12 months. So we're talking about SDR issuance, we're talking about some reallocation. That can be complex and time consuming, but it doesn't have to be, depending on how it's done. I think that needs to happen today for the immediate crisis, but there needs to be a discussion. James's colleagues issued a wonderful paper in 2018 that didn't get enough exposure on the reform of the SDG mechanisms to provide liquidity relief. You know, either countries need to enjoy some of the counter-cyclical liquidity relief that we enjoy in the G20. We need to talk about MDBs. I think Mattia already flagged it, and we'll probably talk again. Financing Commons Summit next week. You know, we and others have been very involved. We need to see, I think, a bolder agenda for development banks, multilaterals, national development banks, expanded mandates, expanded balance sheets to provide that blended finance. The last thing I would say is we do need to think very carefully about the new common debt framework and debt relief. We need DSA frameworks that are truly SDG and climate integrated, so that we define sustainability as being truly about climate and SDG sustainability. Maybe because I spent most of my career in the private sector, and I'll finish here, I think we need to continue to be very careful about discussions on debt relief. We know, and we've seen in Ecuador recently, where there is obvious insolvency, the market can, in the right circumstances, in collaboration with the issuer, with the IMF, achieve quite rapid outcomes. I think we need to be careful about blanket debt relief, because you will destroy private sector confidence in emerging market asset class as an asset class, and that can be very damaging. And I will finish there, Shamshad, because I think Luis will probably take up some of those points.
Thank you for all those thoughtful points that you have raised. Without further elaboration on it, let me turn to Leslie, who, as I already introduced, is the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of New Development Bank, for those who may have joined the conversation now. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you very much. Can you hear and see me at the stage?
Yes, both.
Wonderful, great. Let me start by just saying for 60 seconds something about the New Development Bank. For those of you who might not know of the bank, it's a new creation in the MDB world, if you like. We were created in 2015 alongside Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank here in China. One of the unique features of both AIIB and ourselves is that we have sustainability hard-coded in the very DNA of the institution. In other words, in our articles of agreement, in our legal construct, the word sustainable development is captured in there. So as a consequence, we have today, as you might know, built up a loan portfolio of just over $21 billion, and our energy portfolio within that of just over $3.2 billion is wholly 100% green. So the bank has a very good starting point without the sort of encumbrance of a legacy portfolio, which some of our peers sort of battle with. But obviously all of the other MDBs have very deep sustainability practices in place. The next point I'd like to make is that the multilateral banks currently are in deep introspection mode. There's no question that the depth of this crisis is forcing us to relook at our toolkit, to relook at our approaches, and to look at whether this isn't a moment for us to fundamentally overhaul the nature in which we do our business. A number of the other panelists have already highlighted, for example, that private sector mobilization has to be at the center of the way multilateral banks operate, and that has been a commitment made since 2015 at the Addis Finance for Development Summit, but it is still early days to see the fruits of that. I mean, it's clear that EBRD and IFC in particular have played a very strong leadership role in that regard. But I would venture to suggest that there's a deep-seated culture of lending. In other words, MDBs just using their own balance sheets rather than looking at the potential to use their balance sheets in more imaginative ways to crowd in more private sector capital to development. The next point I'd like to make is that there are, in terms of the toolkit and the instruments, there are existing instruments which could be expanded. And I'll just make, in the interest of time, just a very brief example. The IFC, for example, have a program, a syndication platform called MCPP. It's called Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program. But this is specific to the IFC, where they were able to crowd in a large pool of capital from private investors, about $7-8 billion or so, where the IFC uses their capacity to originate transactions, use their own ESG criteria, and are able to, it's almost a blind pool, if you like, able to bring in other large sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, pension funds to invest alongside them. There is potential, for example, to open up that platform, to have multiple MDBs participate in it, both local national MDBs as well as multilateral MDBs, and potentially increase the size and scope of that sustainable platform into probably 4, 5, or even 10 times the size. I guess what I'm saying is that the depth of this crisis and the fact that it's going to last so much longer, according to the IMF, is really forcing MDBs to go into introspection mode. The third point I'd like to make is that when we designed our crisis response packages to COVID, it was very much us responding to the crisis. I think if I have to rewind the clock to February, the crisis, as you know, the pandemic started here in China, and we were one of the first banks to provide $1 billion of assistance to 3 of the most affected provinces here in China. But in designing that emergency assistance program, we were responding to the crisis. I think if we had to redesign that program today, I would have included much stronger language with respect to the sort of green and sustainable components. However, we do have a context within which sustainability is embedded in the recovery language in the public sector here in China, but it varies in our 5 different markets of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So I guess what I'm saying is that there is a fair degree of consensus that in working on the recovery, we have to strengthen or change, if you like, the economic growth model to be more inclusive, to be more sustainable. But it's at this stage more in the form of declarations. I don't see evidence yet in terms of where the rubber hits the road of a coordinated effort amongst the multilateral banks. I'll just sort of make 1 or 2 final remarks in the sense. Each of our 5 BRICS countries, for example, they have obtained financing to help them combat the economic crisis and the public health crisis in the 5 countries from various MDBs, from the World Bank, from the ADB, from Africa Development Bank, from New Development Bank, and so on. But I don't think there's been effective collaboration and coordination amongst the MDBs. All of the MDBs responded in February, March to the crisis, and there's more than $40 billion committed in the combination of all the MDBs together. But when I look at, for example, our program of assistance to South Africa or to India or even here to China, I do not know the content and the detail of the package of support coming from the other multilateral banks, other than in a high level, it's supporting small businesses, small, medium, and micro enterprises. It's targeting women enterprises and the vulnerable who are disproportionately affected. So I guess what I'm saying is there is scope, and there is scope to have greater collaboration amongst the MDBs as we are searching for ways to become more effective as a system. I think increasingly, I'd like to end off with this point, increasingly now we recognize that the sum of the system is so much bigger than the sum of the parts, that the multilateral banks, if we act in a more cohesive manner, we can shape much more the sustainability agenda because of the sort of public mandate which we have and our role in global public goods. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Coordination amongst MDBs has always been a controversial subject, having lived with them for a long time. So let me turn to our last panelist, last but not the least, Louis, who comes from, as had introduced earlier, from JP Morgan and has an edge in ESG research. So over to you, Louis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akhtar, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this panel. It's actually very good for me to be part of a panel like this with representatives from various other parts of the ecosystem of what we're trying to do here, which is help channel funding for emerging market economies that are clearly needing it the most. Let me try to bring the market perspective to some of the concepts that were brought by my fellow panelists here, and maybe provide some quantification of some of the challenges ahead. So if we start by looking at the fiscal deficit, how it has widened this year compared to last year. Overall for emerging markets, 6.6% of GDP fiscal deficit in 2020, up from literally double last year, 3.2%. Of course, if you start to break it down by region, Latin America looks terrible, going from 3.9% last year to 11.2% this year. So it's almost like tripling, not as bad in EM Asia. And in the case of EMEA, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Africa, also, multiplying by, a factor of like 5. So when you look at the projections, however, for 2021, we have smaller fiscal deficits across the board. And this is a reflection of the impossibility of keep financing these type of fiscal gaps in the market or otherwise, right, for a long period of time. So the contribution to growth, the fiscal thrust that we estimate to be positive in emerging markets this year is going to turn negative already in 2021. And that is the big challenge. So in a way, next year is going to be where I think emerging market countries are going to feel the real squeeze because, probably the space for tapping markets is not going to be as plentiful as it was this year. Certainly, when you look at EM debt to GDP for the government point of view, this year for EM as a whole has gone up to 59%, basically 8 percentage points of GDP in 1 year. Is going to go up maybe another point or two in 2021. If we exclude China, the increase this year is even more impressive, 11 percentage points of GDP. So the indebtedness is going to, preclude most likely, many issuers from tapping markets. What is interesting, though, is that if you look at the aggregate of how much money, how much financing EM sovereigns have raised in the market, this year so far is impressive. Year to date, where we keep a tally of how much sovereign bonds are being issued. This is in hard currency by EM sovereign issuers. It's 191 billion year to date. We have a forecast for a full year of 226. So there's more to come. This compares to only 177 billion last year. So it's already issuance this year by EM sovereigns has already exceeded last year. And when you look at the net financing that we estimate that will be provided by the market to EM sovereigns, this year is going to reach $115 billion, up from 67 billion last year. So if you look at these numbers, you will say, hey, at the end of the day, sovereign issuers from emerging markets, we're able to tap markets. So why are we so stressed? Well, of course, when you start to look into, who was able to come to market, it is basically the higher quality rated sovereigns that were able to do so, double B and above. Single Bs, the only ones who were able to tap markets were ones that were in some kind of IMF program or had some kind of, multilateral or bilateral support that enabled them to do so. Some of these issuance was done with guarantees. So, so we know that next year things are going to get tougher. So I think that this conversation as to what to do here is very pertinent from this perspective. So now identifying the need, I'm going to try to relate some of the concepts that were mentioned in this panel, related to these financing gaps, to the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets that EM countries have, and the financing that cannot be covered by multilaterals alone the private sector needs to cover some of that. Let me try to marry that with the other stream of money that is coming from the ESG point of view. What is interesting is that when we started to look at these two worlds, right, the development finance world and the ESG worlds, it was almost like two worlds that were not talking to each other, right? These two frameworks that honestly were developed for different almost audiences. But what is interesting for us is that when it comes to emerging markets, it is almost like a growing convergence of sorts happening. And I think that this convergence is something that we all need to try to facilitate, because at this moment, there is no unified framework. There's no even unified taxonomy, certainly no standards. And there's a lot of bottlenecks here and there that I think that are going to need to be addressed in the years ahead in order to make facilitate the channeling of these ESG funds into emerging markets. I don't need to put the number for ESG. The numbers are, humongous. It's clearly become part of the mainstream of global finance, right? You can go from the broadest measure that I have seen around is around $45 trillion of assets under management of funds that have any kind of, focus on one of the ESG factors. The more dedicated ESG that they put that in their marketing material, it's a lot more modest. It's around $3 trillion AUM. Still a lot of money. And the question here is, how can EM issuers, try to tap this money? And I think that there is a process here that needs to be done about educating EM issuers in terms of, providing more information for ESG investors to try to, make their instruments, eligible. There is an element of that I think is going to facilitate this, which is, there is a lot of concern among investors about what we would say, greenwashing or that there's in the ESG community, there's a lot more emphasis about trying to measure impact. And we know that in the case of EM, in order to make ESG sustainable, honestly, in the long term, it cannot go against promoting growth, right? So I think that when it comes to emerging markets, the concept of ESG risk cannot be divorced from promoting sustainable growth. And that is where, the worlds of development finance and ESG, I think, are going to be overlapping. Many things to do. The instruments already, Mike mentioned, some of the characteristics that they should have in order to try to facilitate this channeling. From our perspective, sitting at JP Morgan, we need to make, for example, credit enhanced securities, probably be part of the broader EM bond benchmarks, which right now are not. that makes for very inefficient pricing of some of these credit-enhanced securities. Obviously, there's an issue with the ESG indices. ESG scores are, very quite correlated with GDP per capita, which means that the higher rated and the countries that need the money the least are the ones that have the highest ESG scores and try, can benefit from this flow. So all these are, very regressive in a way that they need to be addressed as well. So again, I think that the room for innovation in terms of partnership between private and public sectors is humongous. And I think that COVID is making it all, much more urgent. And I'm again excited that we're having this conversation here. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm very conscious of the time. We have only 5 minutes left rather than the 4 minutes per person that I was expecting at the end. So I think in interest of time, I would recommend that I give the floor for another 1 minute each for any last minute pressing strategic point that you may have, or if there is a question that you want to exchange amongst yourself. So maybe I start with you, Luis, work backwards.
Well, one of the issues, related to what Mike mentioned, some of the proposals that are being presented to the poorer countries, about how to address the squeeze in financing, and proposing this, like 6 months standstill in payments and asking the private sector to participate. I think that the private sector and the way that markets work is not really geared to providing short-term relief, to countries. And I think that, multilateral and bilateral creditors should understand that a country that managed to access capital markets, that alone is a valuable thing that, losing could take a long time, to recover. And I think that oftentimes the solutions that are being presented oversee this factor, right? I mean, of course, we all want a fair, everyone to chip in, but I think that, we should find ways of the private sector to help countries in need without forcing countries to restructure their debt and, blocking them out of capital markets for years to come.
Okay, point well taken, except if a country does not have space to repay, then we are more in trouble. It's better to kind of get an extension then. So let's go to Leslie. Any last minute thoughts? I'm just reversing the order here. Leslie, you are with us. Okay, Mike, over to you.
So I would just use the opportunity, Shamshad, thank you for noting. So I think that there is work going on amongst certainly the IDA countries themselves to define and bring again to the broader international finance community an action plan encompassing a lot of the topics we've talked about today. I would offer an appeal, and we're going to look to try and coordinate and convene a way that all the right institutions, official sector, development banks, private sector, the issuers themselves, the other players in the ecosystem can really come together now and start actually moving on some slightly more concrete steps. I'm afraid I do think 6 months has been lost a little bit here. The SSI in particular has not really been the right instrument to move us forward. And I think that really, from this discussion today, you've heard just wonderful ideas from the other panelists and very critical. And now we need a single institutional setup to actually start enacting them. Thank you.
That is clearly a need of the day. I agree with you that DSSI has been very disappointing thus far, both in terms of the amounts involved, but also in terms of the misutilization of the funds is what I would put straight, because there was an opportunity to deploy them in activities that could be much more greener growth or whatever we call it. So over to you, James, now.
Okay, I'll try to be very quick. So really, this has been a fantastic discussion and very, very useful for me to listen to. I just wanted to come back on the one point maybe from Lewis. I mean, I think we're totally worried about this point about 2021, about the tap being turned off exactly when it needs to be kept open. And we do think that in general, debt sustainability may not be as bad as you see from the headline increases in debt. Now, this depends, of course, massively from country to country. But one of the points that our fiscal monitor has been making is that if we look at the debt dynamics, the sort of classic R minus G, R is so low for so long. We can lock in very long interest rates, and that does suggest that countries can borrow more, but they don't necessarily want to always. Ministries of Finance can be quite conservative about this too, and so I think the importance is to keep that message that it is safe to borrow, it is wise to borrow for investment and to spend now. But of course, this does depend country to country, and keep that sustainability at the fore with this sort of vision of debt sustainability in mind. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Let me try once again. Leslie, if you have any other last minute thoughts.
I'll be very brief.
Okay,
I'll be very brief on the issue of debt sustainability, as I didn't comment on it earlier on. I just want to make 2 points really. The first one is that DSSI was conceptualized originally and still is really just a necessary stopgap measure. I don't think those in the G20 have had any different idea. The more important point, I think, though, is that we have to search for a more comprehensive, more holistic, more long-term approach, or rather, put differently, we need a permanent solution because there's been such a spiraling of public debt almost in an uncontrollable fashion, and to some degree, fiscal prudence have really been thrown out the window in the interest of dealing with the crisis. So we need to go back to the drawing boards and be much more imaginative about how we're going to manage it on a more sustainable long-term manner. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Over to now. Who else? Mattia, we come back to you.
Shamshad, thank you. Yeah. The last word just on two issues. I listened very carefully. Very interesting conversations. So I wanted to point to two things that I noticed from the conversation. I mean, the first one is that we've been hit by what is probably the closest the world ever gets to an exogenous shock. When you get hit by an exogenous shock, it's inevitable that a lot would be destroyed. And we saw a lot of our economies being destroyed. Now, this does offer an incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rebuild different. Why would you rebuild the economies as they were before when we know that these economies were inefficient in pricing carbon, in taking into consideration externalities, in dealing with inequality? There's such a great opportunity to rebuild in a different way. Now, the thing that worries me a lot from this conversation is that in order to rebuild, you need the money. And what we're seeing is emerging markets may face a very dry tap in a year's time. Now, this to me calls for really emergency and urgency, because if we have an opportunity to rebuild different, we want to put emerging and developing countries at the forefront of the transformation. We want them to be the first that rebuild green. We want them to be the first that innovate and have access to these new sources of growth, jobs, innovation, and well-being. So I think these 2 points together point to an amazing opportunity, but also a big risk. And this conversation points me really to the need, absolute need, to be super careful on this agenda and really prioritize the ability of emerging markets to have the tools to rebuild better first.
As all of you have pointed out, it's been a fascinating discussion. And I must say, each of the speakers have come around bringing in additional perspectives, but also there has been quite a systematic, there's quite a bit of relevance in what each of the panelists have contributed. Let me just end by not only just thanking you all, but also being so coordinated without being coordinated, as I see. So even though multilateral development banks may not be that coordinated, at least our panel is. And I fully agree with almost everything that has been said. And it's been nice to meet up with some of the colleagues who I had known, particularly you and James. Of course, I had seen you in IMF here and there. So thanks to our organizers from the Reinventing Bretton Woods. Particularly Mark has been fantastic to provide us this floor to discuss these issues. And there's a lot that we have not been able to cover, but that's simply because this is such a big agenda. And I don't need to sum up in interest of time because we're already 5 minutes above. Thank you.